the smell was unmistakable. It drifted through the broken windows of the damaged school building that had been repurposed by the Americans in the small Polish town of Żagań. On February 12, 1945, 11-year-old Marek Kowalski followed his nose through the rubble-strewn streets, his younger sister Anya clutching his hand as they navigated the war-torn landscape. 6 years of German occupation had taught them caution, had trained them to be invisible, to scavenge without being caught. But this scent, rich, sweet, impossible, pulled them forward with a power stronger than fear. "It smells like the chocolate Papa brought home before the war," Anya whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. What the children discovered as they peered through a crack in the wooden barricade around the American camp defied 5 years of carefully constructed Nazi propaganda. Inside the makeshift distribution center, dozens of American soldiers were assembling care packages. Mountains of chocolate bars, not single pieces, but stacks upon stacks, were being casually handled, broken, shared, and even discarded when damaged. Tins of meat, bags of sugar, cartons of cigarettes, and items the children couldn't even identify formed small hills on tables throughout the room. What Marek saw defied 6 years of systematic deprivation, of stories about American poverty, of claims that Poland's allies were as desperate and hungry as they were. Here was abundance beyond imagination, treated with such casualness that soldiers were eating chocolate while working, breaking pieces off and tossing them to each other across the room. For a moment, Marek thought they must be hallucinating from hunger. His family had survived on watery soup, foraged mushrooms, and occasional bread for years. The idea that anyone could have this much food, enough to give away, simply didn't align with the world as he understood it. The German broadcasts they'd been forced to listen to had described Americans as desperate, starving people, fighting a losing battle across 2 oceans with inadequate supplies and failing morale. Yet here they were, surrounded by more food than Marek had seen in the entirety of the war, casually assembling packages to give away to strangers. What happened next would shatter 6 years of carefully crafted propaganda and begin a transformation in this small Polish community that would ripple outward across the decades, changing not just how they saw their liberators, but how they understood the entire conflict that had consumed their world. The occupation of Poland had begun on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion that sparked World War II. For nearly 6 years, the Polish population had endured one of the most brutal occupation regimes in Europe. The Nazi administration had systematically targeted Polish culture, education, and national identity while extracting resources and labor for the German war machine. An estimated 1/5 of Poland's pre-war population perished during the occupation, including approximately 3 million Polish Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust. Throughout the occupation, German propaganda had worked tirelessly to isolate the Polish population from hope of rescue. Radio broadcasts, posters, and newspaper articles portrayed the Western Allies as decadent but weak, lacking the industrial capacity and will to defeat Germany. By 1943, with rationing intensified across occupied Europe, Polish civilians were allocated official rations that provided less than 900 calories per day, less than half the minimum needed for basic health maintenance. The reality was even worse, as these meager official rations were often unavailable, forcing families to turn to the black market or forage for survival. In German-controlled schools and through censored media, Polish children were taught that America was a land of extremes, fabulous wealth for a tiny few, but grinding poverty for most. They were told that American soldiers were poorly equipped, their weapons inferior, their supplies perpetually short. German propaganda emphasized that American industrial capacity had been crippled by the Great Depression and could not sustain a war effort across 2 oceans. Children like Marek and Ania had grown up hearing that America was a failing experiment, populated by mixed races, incapable of competing with German efficiency and ingenuity. The reality could not have been more different. By 1945, the United States had achieved industrial production levels that seemed impossible to Europeans living under wartime conditions. American factories were producing a new military aircraft every 5 minutes, a new ship every single day. While European civilians wore clothes patched and repatched until they disintegrated, American factories produced more than 500 million pairs of shoes during the war years. Monthly meat production in America exceeded 1 billion pounds, while Polish families might not see meat for months at a time. The contrast was most stark in caloric intake. By 1945, the average American civilian consumed about 3,400 calories daily, nearly 4 times what a Polish person might access through official channels. American soldiers were allocated approximately 4,000 calories per day, with additional supplements for combat troops. This abundance meant that American supply sergeants often dealt with surplus rather than shortage, a concept incomprehensible to Europeans who had endured years of progressively worsening deprivation. Before the war, Poland had been a land of relative plenty. Though not as industrialized as Western Europe, its fertile plains had produced abundant food, and major cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Łódź had thriving middle classes enjoying modern amenities. 6 years of occupation had transformed this reality. By February 1945, when the American forces began arriving in liberated areas of Western Poland, they encountered a population physically transformed by hunger. Adults had lost an average of 25 to 30 pounds. Children exhibited stunted growth, with many appearing years younger than their actual age. The Kowalski family represented this transformation in microcosm. Before the war, Tomasz Kowalski had been a mathematics teacher at the local gymnasium in Żagań. His wife Helena worked as a seamstress, supplementing their comfortable middle-class income. Their home had contained books, a radio, even a small piano, where Anya had begun taking lessons at age 4. The invasion had cost Tomasz his position as the Germans closed Polish secondary schools. The family piano was confiscated for the war effort. The radio was surrendered under penalty of death. By 1945, the once prosperous family survived in 2 rooms of their damaged home, with Tomasz working as a forced laborer, repairing railway lines, and Helena sewing German military uniforms in a converted factory. Their experience was multiplied across millions of Polish families, creating a societal trauma that made the American arrival seem like a mirage, too good to be true and potentially temporary. This was the context in which Marek and Anya Kowalski peered through that crack in the fence and began their journey of discovery, a journey that would forever change how they understood not just Americans, but the entire narrative of the war that had dominated their childhood. The hole in the wooden fence was small, just enough for Marek to press his eye against, with Anya impatiently waiting her turn. Inside the school gymnasium, which had been commandeered first by German forces and now by the Americans, a scene of impossible abundance unfolded. Tables had been arranged in long rows with different stations for assembling care packages. At the first station, American soldiers in rolled-up sleeves placed items into sturdy boxes: canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, and other items Marek couldn't immediately identify. "Let me see," Anya whispered urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "1 minute," Marek replied, unable to tear his eyes away from the impossible scene. What struck him most was not just the quantity of goods, but the casual way the soldiers handled them. One soldier, a tall man with red hair, was eating a chocolate bar while working, not breaking off small pieces to make it last, as Marek would have done with any precious sweet, but taking large bites, finishing the entire bar in minutes, then reaching for another from an open carton beside him. The carton held dozens of identical bars. When Marek finally let his sister take his place at the viewing hole, her gasp was audible enough that he worried they'd be discovered. But the Americans inside were playing music on a phonograph, filling the air with jazzy tunes unlike anything the children had heard during the occupation years, when owning such records could result in severe punishment. "There's more chocolate than in all of Poland," Anya whispered, her voice trembling with excitement and disbelief. The children might have remained there, transfixed by this vision of abundance, had not Staff Sergeant Michael Dominguez noticed their shadows through the damaged window near their hiding spot. Rather than chasing them away, as German soldiers invariably would have done, he smiled and beckoned them closer. "Hey there," he called in English, then tried broken German. "Kinder? Come here." Marek and Anya froze, the instinct to flee warring with desperate hunger and curiosity. Sergeant Dominguez, a 24-year-old from San Antonio, Texas, had been working with Polish refugees for several weeks since his unit of the 90th Infantry Division had arrived in the area. He recognized the look of terrified hunger in the children's eyes. From his pocket, he pulled 2 chocolate bars and held them out, making exaggerated eating motions to communicate his intent. "It's okay," he said softly, knowing they probably wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone would reassure them. "You're safe now." After a moment's hesitation, Marek made a decision that would alter not just that afternoon, but the trajectory of his understanding. He gripped Anya's hand tightly and stepped cautiously around the fence toward the American soldier. Each step felt dangerous, conditioned as they were to avoid uniformed men, but the smell of chocolate pulled them forward with irresistible force. When Sergeant Dominguez placed a Hershey's chocolate bar in each child's hand, the moment transcended the simple act of giving food to hungry children. It represented the first tangible evidence contradicting years of propaganda. These weren't the desperate Americans depicted in German newsreels, but well-fed, well-supplied soldiers with enough resources to give freely to refugee children. The chocolate itself became a revelation. Marek broke his bar carefully in half, giving the larger portion to Anya, expecting they would save most of it for their parents and savor tiny pieces over many days. When Sergeant Dominguez realized their intention, he went back inside and returned with 6 more bars. "For your family," he said, miming eating and pointing in the direction from which they had come. Marek stared at the additional chocolate, more than they had seen in 6 years, and struggled to comprehend this casual generosity. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the war and the wider world. If the Americans could so casually distribute what had become legendary treasures in occupied Poland, what else about the German narrative might be untrue? The encounter might have ended there, a simple act of kindness in a war-ravaged landscape. But Captain Robert Anderson, the officer overseeing the distribution center, noticed Sergeant Dominguez with the children. Anderson, a 32-year-old former history teacher from Ohio, had been deeply affected by the conditions he'd encountered in liberated Poland. He approached the small group with a translator, a Polish-American private named Stefan Wojcik. Through Wojcik, Captain Anderson asked the children about their circumstances, where they lived, if their parents were alive, how many siblings they had. When he learned that their father had been a teacher before the war, a profession he himself had practiced, he made a decision that would transform the Kowalski family's experience of the war's end. "Tell them to bring their parents tomorrow," Anderson instructed Wojcik. "We need local help with distribution, especially people who can read and write. We'll pay in food and supplies." This invitation would lead Tomasz Kowalski into direct collaboration with the American forces, a position that would expose him to the full scale of American logistical capabilities and permanently shatter his understanding of the global conflict that had consumed his country. The following morning, with considerable trepidation, Tomasz and Helena Kowalski followed their children to the American distribution center. 6 years of occupation had taught them caution, bordering on paranoia. The Germans had frequently used promises of food or work to lure Polish civilians into traps. But the 8 chocolate bars their children had brought home, an impossible bounty, suggested this might be different. Captain Anderson greeted Tomasz with a handshake, a gesture of equality that immediately distinguished American forces from the German occupiers, who had enforced elaborate rules preventing racial inferiors from such basic human courtesies. Through Private Wojcik's translation, Anderson explained that they needed locals to help identify the most vulnerable community members and assist with fair distribution of relief supplies. "We have enough to help everyone," Anderson explained, a statement so at odds with 6 years of desperate scarcity that Tomasz initially thought something had been lost in translation. To demonstrate the scale of available resources, Anderson gave the Kowalskis a tour of the distribution center. What they saw defied comprehension. In one corner, cartons of cigarettes were stacked 6 feet high, hundreds of thousands of cigarettes in a single room, when a single pack had been worth a small fortune on the black market days earlier. Sacks of sugar and flour, each weighing 50 pounds, formed a wall along one side of the gymnasium. Canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate, coffee, soap, and medical supplies were organized in quantities that seemed impossible after years when finding a single egg could require hours of searching and bartering. "This is just one day's distribution for your town," Anderson explained through the translator. "Tomorrow, more trucks will arrive." For Helena Kowalski, the revelation came when Captain Anderson casually mentioned that any damaged food items were discarded rather than distributed. "We maintain strict quality control," he said as Private Wojcik translated. "If cans are dented or packages torn, we don't give them out." Helena, who had carefully salvaged every scrap of food for years, making soup from potato peels and stretching a single onion across multiple meals, found this casual disposal of damaged but perfectly edible food more shocking than the mountains of supplies themselves. It revealed not just abundance, but a margin of excess so great that cosmetic imperfections justified waste. "You throw away food that isn't perfect?" she asked through the translator, her voice catching. Anderson, recognizing her disbelief, modified the policy on the spot. "From now on, we'll set aside any damaged items for immediate local use, if your family can help distribute them." This moment, the casual adjustment of a wasteful policy inconceivable in occupied Poland, became the first of many revelations that would accumulate over the coming weeks, each deepening the cognitive dissonance between what the Kowalskis had been told about their allies and the reality they now witnessed firsthand. Tomasz Kowalski's position as a liaison between American forces and the local population gave him unprecedented access to the inner workings of the American supply system. On February 20th, 1945, 8 days after his children had first discovered the distribution center, he was invited to accompany Captain Anderson to a regional supply depot 30 miles away, where he witnessed the arrival of a convoy of 42 trucks carrying relief supplies. The scale left him speechless. Each truck carried approximately 5 tons of supplies, a total of more than 200 tons arriving in a single convoy. The depot itself contained warehouses filled with supplies organized with industrial efficiency, medical supplies in one section, food in another, clothing and shoes in a third, construction materials in a fourth. The systematic approach reminded Tomasz of pre-war factories, a level of organization that seemed impossible amid the chaos of war's end. "How often do these convoys arrive?" he asked through Private Wojcik. "Every 3 days for this region," Captain Anderson replied. "There are 7 similar depots serving liberated areas of Poland." The mathematics overwhelmed Tomasz, whose analytical mind immediately calculated the implications. 7 depots receiving 200 tons every 3 days meant approximately 15,000 tons of supplies weekly just for civilian relief in Poland. This figure didn't include military supplies, fuel, ammunition, or equipment. The productive capacity required to generate, transport, and distribute such quantities across thousands of miles while simultaneously fighting a war on multiple fronts suggested an industrial capability that made German efficiency seem primitive by comparison. For a mathematician like Tomasz, these numbers told a story more convincing than any propaganda. The German war machine, which had seemed invincible in 1939, had been fighting an enemy capable of producing and distributing material in quantities that made ultimate Allied victory a mathematical certainty. The war's outcome, he realized, had been determined not on battlefields but in factories thousands of miles away, where American productive capacity had simply overwhelmed the Axis' ability to compete. This revelation was reinforced when he observed American soldiers casually discarding items that would have been precious in occupied Poland. Cigarette butts tossed aside when they could have been re-rolled. Empty cans thrown into waste bins rather than repurposed. Damaged uniform items replaced rather than repaired. Each small act of casual waste represented a productive margin so vast that conservation, the driving necessity of European wartime economies, became optional rather than essential. The most profound illustration came when Tomasz observed the personal equipment of average American soldiers. Each carried items that would have been unimaginable luxuries: wristwatches, quality boots, leather wallets containing photographs, personal hygiene items, even small cameras. These weren't officers or elite troops, but ordinary enlisted men, many from working-class backgrounds, the sons of factory workers, farmers, and shopkeepers carrying items that, in pre-war Poland, would have marked middle-class prosperity. Captain Anderson, noticing Tomasz's fascination with this personal abundance, explained that American soldiers received regular care packages from home, supplementing their already substantial military provisions. "My wife sends cookies every 2 weeks," he mentioned casually. "Usually they arrive stale, but it's the thought that counts. The concept of sending cookies, using precious sugar, butter, and flour for treats that might arrive in poor condition across thousands of miles during wartime, struck Tomasz as almost obscene in its casual disregard for scarcity. It suggested a home front experiencing not just adequate supply, but surplus comfort, even as Europe starved under occupation and rationing. As February turned to March, the Kowalski family's direct exposure to American abundance began transforming not just their understanding of the war, but their physical condition and psychological outlook. Working with the distribution center provided them with regular meals from the American field kitchen, meals that contained more protein and calories in a single sitting than they had sometimes received in a week during the occupation. Helena, who had become gaunt during the war years, gained 7 pounds in the first 3 weeks of American food. The children's transformation was even more dramatic. Anya, who had developed the slightly swollen belly characteristic of malnourished children, returned to a healthier appearance within a month. Marek, whose growth had been stunted by years of inadequate nutrition, experienced a growth spurt that would eventually add 4 inches to his height by year's end. This physical transformation was happening throughout the community as American supplies flowed into the region. Children who had known nothing but deprivation suddenly had access to milk, meat, and fresh fruits. Adults who had been systematically weakened by caloric restriction found their energy returning, their thinking becoming clearer, their capacity for hope reawakening. The psychological impact was equally profound. Families who had been trained by years of occupation to hoard every scrap, to view each possession as potentially irreplaceable, began to internalize the concept that more would come tomorrow, that scarcity was no longer the defining reality of their existence. This shift from a scarcity mindset to one that could contemplate future abundance represented a fundamental reorientation, as significant in its way as the physical healing taking place throughout the community. For the Kowalski children, this transformation found expression in their play. Before the Americans arrived, Marek and Ania had played quiet games indoors, speaking in whispers, avoiding attention. By April, they were playing outdoors with other neighborhood children, their games louder, more physical, more exuberant. They began collecting discarded items from the American camp, empty ration tins, cardboard boxes, even colorful food wrappers, treasuring these artifacts of abundance as talismans of a new reality. The American presence transformed not just material conditions, but cultural horizons. Soldiers shared music, magazines, photographs of American cities and landscapes. Through these casual cultural exchanges, Polish civilians glimpsed a world beyond war and occupation, a world where ordinary people owned automobiles, lived in houses with indoor plumbing, and attended cinemas showing Hollywood films that had been banned under occupation. This cultural exposure complemented the material abundance, creating a multidimensional portrait of American life that stood in stark contrast to German propaganda depictions. The Americans weren't just well supplied. They carried with them cultural artifacts suggesting a society where working-class comfort exceeded what had been middle-class luxury in pre-war Poland. This revelation that ordinary factory workers in Detroit or farmers in Iowa might live better than professors or doctors in Warsaw undermined not just Nazi propaganda, but older European social hierarchies. By mid-April 1945, as spring began cautiously returning to the war-ravaged landscape, the transformation in Żagań had progressed from individual revelation to community-wide reassessment. The presence of American abundance, not just food and supplies, but evidence of a society organized on fundamentally different principles, was forcing a reevaluation of assumptions that went beyond wartime propaganda. To touch on deeper questions about social organization and economic possibilities. This reevaluation found expression in a moment that Tomasz Kowalski would remember decades later. On April 17th, he was helping unload medical supplies at the distribution center when a young American lieutenant named James Wilson approached him with a camera, a Kodak Brownie that Wilson carried everywhere, documenting his war experience. "May I take your picture?" Wilson asked through Private Warwick. "I'm keeping a record." The request itself reflected American abundance. Film was available for personal use. Cameras were durable enough to bring to war zones, and soldiers had both the equipment and leisure to document their experiences. But it was Wilson's explanation that struck Tomasz most deeply. "I want to remember the people we're helping," Wilson said. "When I get home, I'm going to college on the GI Bill. Might study history or economics. These photos will remind me why it matters." In this casual statement, Tomasz encountered yet another dimension of American abundance. Wilson, an ordinary lieutenant from a farming background in Nebraska, spoke of attending university after the war as a certainty, not a distant dream. The GI Bill he referenced, a government program providing education funding for veterans, suggested a society investing in its citizens regardless of class background. The casual way Wilson mentioned studying history or economics implied choice and opportunity extending beyond material necessities to intellectual pursuits. For Tomasz, who had been a teacher and who valued education above almost everything, this casual reference to educational opportunity available to a farmer's son from Nebraska represented a form of abundance more profound than chocolate or cigarettes. It suggested a society where knowledge itself was treated not as a scarce resource to be carefully controlled, as it had been under occupation, when higher education for Poles was forbidden, but as something to be widely distributed like food or medicine. The conversation with Lieutenant Wilson led to a deeper exchange about educational systems and opportunities in America versus pre-war and occupied Poland. Wilson described growing up on a farm where books were limited, but education valued. He explained how his rural school had offered fewer opportunities than urban schools, but still provided pathways to college for motivated students. He shared his plans to perhaps become a teacher himself, using the GI Bill to obtain credentials that would have been financially out of reach without government support. This conversation, translated by Private Wojciech but occasionally supplemented by Tomasz's limited English and Wilson's phrase book, Polish, became a turning point in Tomasz's understanding of American society. The food, the equipment, the supplies, these had demonstrated material abundance, but Wilson's casual certainty about educational opportunity revealed a different kind of abundance, access to knowledge, to social mobility, to self-determination. The impact of this revelation radiated outward as Tomasz shared it with his family and neighbors. For people who had been systematically denied education during the occupation, who had conducted secret schools in basements at risk of severe punishment, the concept of government-funded university education for veterans, regardless of class background, seemed as miraculous as the mountains of supplies in American warehouses. It suggested not just material wealth, but a fundamentally different conception of who deserved access to opportunity. This expanding awareness of American abundance, material, cultural, educational, and ultimately philosophical, was replicated across Poland and throughout Europe as Allied forces encountered populations systematically misinformed about the outside world. each chocolate bar distributed, each pair of sturdy boots worn by an ordinary soldier, each casual reference to cars or refrigerators or suburban homes owned by factory workers contributed to a comprehensive rewriting of what Europeans understood about American society. The accumulated evidence of American abundance became impossible to reconcile with years of propaganda depicting a struggling nation crippled by the Great Depression and incapable of sustaining a major war effort. The cognitive dissonance created by this contradiction forced a fundamental reassessment not just of the war's progress, but of the social and economic systems that had produced such divergent outcomes. By May 1945, as news of Germany's surrender reached even remote Polish communities, the transformation in understanding had progressed from shock to acceptance to active engagement with a new reality. For the Kowalski family, this engagement took the form of a decision that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Tomasz began formally studying English with the help of Lieutenant Wilson and other American personnel, with the long-term goal of potentially emigrating to the United States. This decision wasn't made lightly. The Kowalskis were deeply Polish in identity and attachment. Their family had lived in the Żagań region for generations, but the glimpse they had received of American possibility, especially educational opportunity for their children, made them willing to contemplate leaving their homeland for a society that seemed to offer not just material comfort, but expanded horizons. The decision was accelerated by growing awareness of political realities. As Soviet forces consolidated control in eastern Poland and tension between Western allies and the Soviet Union increased, many Poles recognized that their liberation might be transitioning into a new form of occupation. The abundance represented by American forces might be temporary, replaced by a Soviet system that, while ideologically different from Nazi occupation, seemed unlikely to produce comparable material prosperity or personal freedom. This political calculation added urgency to the cultural and economic reassessment already underway. For families like the Kowalskis, the question became not just what to believe about American society, but whether to actively seek participation in it. This question transformed theoretical comparisons into practical decisions with life-altering implications. The depth of transformation occurring in Żagań and similar communities was revealed through physical evidence, documentary records, and personal testimonies. American military reports noted with surprise the rapid health improvements in liberated populations receiving relief supplies. Medical officers documented weight gain, improved energy levels, and reduced incidence of deficiency diseases like rickets and scurvy. Psychological assessments noted reduced anxiety, improved sleep, and greater optimism about the future, all within weeks of reliable food distribution. These official observations were complemented by personal records, diaries, letters, and later oral histories documenting the impact of encountered abundance on individuals and communities. Helena Kowalski began keeping a diary in March 1945, recording her observations of American provisions and their effect on her family. Her entry from March 12th captured the ongoing psychological adjustment. Today I found myself hiding a tin of meat under the floorboard, even though we received 3 tins yesterday and will receive more tomorrow. 6 years of hiding food has become a habit I cannot break, even when Tomasz tells me it isn't necessary anymore. The Americans throw away more food than we ate in a month during the worst times. I still cannot believe this is our reality now. This diary entry illustrated the persistence of scarcity behaviors even amid new abundance, psychological lag that would characterize many Europeans' adjustment to post-war conditions. The habits formed during years of deprivation, hoarding, hiding, carefully measuring, and rationing didn't disappear immediately when supplies became available. The psychological transformation lagged behind the material change, creating a transitional period when behaviors appropriate to scarcity persisted amid new abundance. This psychological adjustment was particularly challenging for adults who had lived independent lives before the war. Children, more adaptable and with fewer pre-war memories, adjusted more quickly to new conditions. By April, Marek and Anya were taking American abundance for granted, casually expecting chocolate with meals and expressing preferences among different types of canned meat. For their parents, each distributed item remained miraculous, its casual receipt still requiring conscious adjustment of expectations. The depth of this psychological adjustment was reflected in community behavior. During the first weeks of American distribution, crowds gathered hours before scheduled openings, fearing supplies might run out before everyone received their share. By April, these crowds had diminished as community members internalized the reality that supplies were truly sufficient for all, that tomorrow would bring more rather than less. This transition from desperate competition to confident expectation represented a profound psychological shift, reversing years of trained behavior under scarcity conditions. The documentary record captured not just the fact of this transformation, but its cascading effects across multiple domains of life. As basic needs were reliably met, communities began directing attention to higher-order concerns: education, cultural activities, religious services, civic organization. American military government reports noted increasing attendance at churches, formation of community committees, reopening of schools, and organization of cultural events, all indicators of a population moving beyond survival preoccupations toward rebuilding normal social functions. This progression illustrated psychologist Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs in real-time application. As physiological requirements were reliably satisfied, attention shifted to safety, social connection, esteem, and eventually self-actualization. Communities that in February had been focused exclusively on finding enough food to survive until tomorrow were by May organizing concerts, reopening schools, and planning for long-term reconstruction. The American abundance that catalyzed this transformation went far beyond food and basic supplies. As the immediate crisis of hunger receded, other dimensions of American capacity became visible through military presence. Medical technology, transportation networks, communication systems, educational resources. Each aspect of American operations provided additional evidence contradicting years of propaganda and suggesting alternative possibilities for post-war reconstruction. Medical services particularly impressed communities accustomed to years of inadequate care. American field hospitals introduced antibiotics like penicillin, still relatively new and in limited supply even in the United States, but deployed to combat zones and made available to civilian populations in liberated areas. These medications, capable of curing infections that had been frequently fatal during the occupation years, seemed miraculous to populations that had endured years of medical deprivation. Transportation infrastructure demonstrated another dimension of American capacity. Roads damaged by years of war and neglect were quickly repaired by American engineering units equipped with specialized vehicles and abundant fuel. Supply convoys moved with reliability that made German military transport seem primitive by comparison. The casual certainty that supplies would arrive on schedule, overcoming weather, damaged infrastructure, and lingering security threats, contrasted sharply with the increasingly erratic German distribution systems of the war's final years. Communication networks revealed yet another aspect of American advantage. Field telephones, radios, and teletype machines kept American units connected across vast distances, enabling coordination impossible for resistance forces that had relied on couriers and coded messages. The speed and reliability of American communications, like their transportation and supply systems, suggested an underlying industrial and organizational capacity that had rendered German defeat inevitable, regardless of battlefield tactics or troop courage. Each of these systems, medical, transportation, communication, supply, operated with a margin of redundancy and excess capacity that European observers found difficult to comprehend after years when every resource was stretched beyond sustainable limits. The American approach assumed failure at some points in the system and built in reserves to compensate, a luxury impossible in the resource-constrained German war machine of 1945. This systemic redundancy was perhaps the most profound revelation for observers like Tomasz Kowalski, whose mathematical mind recognized it as evidence not just of current abundance, but of productive capacity, so vast it could absorb significant inefficiency without compromising overall effectiveness. The Germans had built a war machine that required everything to work perfectly to succeed. The Americans had built one that could succeed even with significant waste and failure at multiple points in the system. By June 1945, as Europe began the long process of reconstruction, the transformation initiated by encountered American abundance was evolving from immediate shock to longer-term reassessment. For families like the Kowalskis, decisions about their future increasingly incorporated their revised understanding of global realities. The children, Marek and Anya, began studying English with the same determination their father showed, recognizing it as a potential key to future opportunities. This practical adaptation reflected a deeper philosophical adjustment, a shift from viewing the world through the lens of inevitable scarcity to one that could imagine sustainable abundance. This shift manifested in concrete ways: willingness to invest in education rather than focusing exclusively on immediate survival, ability to delay gratification in pursuit of longer-term goals, capacity to imagine multiple possible futures rather than a single predetermined outcome. The psychological impact of this shift extended beyond individuals to affect community function and national reconstruction priorities. Communities exposed to American abundance began rebuilding with different assumptions and aspirations than those that remained under more restrictive Soviet influence. These divergent paths would become increasingly apparent as post-war Europe divided along Cold War lines, with expectations and outcomes shaped partly by these early post-liberation experiences. For the Kowalski family, the transformation culminated in a decision made in August 1945, when Tomasz accepted an offer to work as a translator for American forces temporarily headquartered in Frankfurt, Germany. This position, which came with the possibility of eventual sponsorship for emigration to the United States, represented not just improved immediate circumstances, but a fundamental reorientation of family aspirations. The decision wasn't without controversy. Helena initially resisted leaving Poland, concerned about separating the children from their cultural roots and extended family connections. Their debate, conducted over several weeks of intense discussion, reflected the competing pulls of national identity and expanded opportunity that would characterize many post-war decisions throughout Europe. "How can we leave Poland when it needs rebuilding?" Helena argued. "This is our home, our history, our language," Tomasz countered, with what had become his central insight from months of working alongside Americans. The children deserve more than survival. They deserve the chance to thrive. This tension between loyalty to place and pursuit of opportunity would shape migration patterns throughout post-war Europe as millions made similar calculations based on their revised understanding of global possibilities. Those with direct exposure to American abundance, whether through military contact, relief work, or cultural exchange, were more likely to contemplate emigration, having seen concrete evidence of alternatives to European austerity. The Kowalskis' decision to leave for Frankfurt in September 1945 wasn't a rejection of Polish identity, but a pragmatic choice based on reassessed possibilities. They carried with them not just the few possessions they had salvaged from the war, but a fundamentally transformed understanding of what constituted normal material conditions and reasonable expectations for the future. This transformed understanding would shape not just their personal trajectory, but their contribution to post-war reconstruction. Tomasz's work as a translator put him in position to influence resource allocation decisions, consistently advocating for educational investment based on his recognition that human capital development had been central to American advantage. His observations about American production methods, shared through correspondence with former colleagues who remained in Poland, contributed to evolving economic thinking about post-war recovery strategies. The impact of American abundance on European Reconstruction extended far beyond individual families like the Kowalskis. The Marshall Plan, formally proposed in June 1947, institutionalized the approach first glimpsed by Polish communities encountering American relief efforts. The scale of this program, providing more than $13 billion in economic assistance to Western European nations between 1948 and 1952, demonstrated the same seemingly impossible abundance that had shocked Marek and Anya when they first peered through that fence in February 1945. The numbers revealed a truth no propaganda could hide. American productive capacity, having scaled up for wartime production, could now redirect that capacity toward reconstruction without significant domestic sacrifice. While European economies struggled to meet basic needs, American factories could produce enough to supply both domestic markets and massive foreign aid programs simultaneously. The mathematics of this reality fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance, creating a stark contrast between American-assisted recovery in Western Europe and Soviet-dominated reconstruction in Eastern Europe. This contrast became most visible at the boundaries between these spheres of influence. In Berlin, divided between Western and Soviet control, the difference in material conditions became so pronounced that it ultimately required physical barriers, culminating in the Berlin Wall to prevent mass migration from east to west. The abundance glimpsed by Polish children following the scent of chocolate in 1945 had become, by the 1950s, a systemic reality visible across continental divides. For those who had directly experienced the revelation of American abundance during the war's final months, this divergence confirmed their revised understanding. The initial shock of encountering impossible wealth amid European devastation had evolved into recognition of structural differences in economic organization that produced consistently different outcomes. The casual waste that had first seemed most shocking. American soldiers discarding partially eaten chocolate or damaged supply items had revealed itself as evidence of productive margins, so vast they rendered precise conservation unnecessary. The long-term impact of this revelation played out across decades of Cold War competition. Soviet propaganda consistently emphasized equality of distribution rather than absolute abundance, a tacit acknowledgement that in total productive capacity, the comparison remained unfavorable. Eastern Bloc countries could promise that no one would become disproportionately wealthy, but they couldn't promise that everyone would have a private automobile, a suburban home, or an annual vacation, staples of American working-class life by the 1960s. This reality was reinforced through continued contact with American abundance, whether through military deployment, cultural exchange, or smuggled consumer goods. Each encounter with Western products, from blue jeans to rock music to color television, served as a reminder of the revelation first experienced by communities like Jagain in 1945. The cumulative effect of these encounters gradually undermined official narratives throughout Eastern Europe, creating cognitive dissonance that would contribute to the system's eventual collapse. For the Kowalski family, the transformation that began with children following the smell of chocolate culminated in emigration to the United States in 1952, after 7 years working with American forces in Germany. Their journey from occupied Poland to Chicago, Illinois, represented not just physical relocation, but complete ideological reorientation, from survivors of systematic deprivation to participants in the world's most productive economy. The contrast remained surreal even years after their arrival. Helena Kowalski's diary entry from December 12, 1955, captured this ongoing adjustment. Today I went to the supermarket alone while Tomasz was at work. I still cannot become accustomed to the abundance. 20 different types of bread, 30 kinds of cheese, fruits from places I'd never heard of before coming to America. I found myself counting the varieties of breakfast cereal, 47 different boxes. During the occupation, we made coffee from roasted acorns and bread from sawdust mixed with potato scraps. Here, the problem is too many choices rather than no choice at all. After 10 years, I still sometimes weep in the grocery store. remembering how we searched for hours to find a single potato during the winter of 1944. This entry illustrated the persistence of war memories. Even amid new prosperity, the way past deprivation continued shaping perception and behavior long after circumstances changed. For Helena, like many European immigrants of her generation, American abundance never became entirely normal. Each shopping trip, each restaurant meal, each casual disposal of still usable items remained marked by comparison with wartime scarcity. This persistent awareness shaped the family's participation in American consumer culture. While their neighbors might purchase new appliances when styles changed, the Kowalskis replaced items only when they ceased functioning. While other families discarded clothing that went out of fashion, Helena altered and repurposed garments until they disintegrated. While neighborhood children received new toys regularly, Marek and Anya were taught to value education and experiences over material possessions. These habits, maintaining wartime conservation amid post-war abundance, distinguished many European immigrants from native-born Americans who had never experienced systemic scarcity. The contrast created occasional cultural friction, but also contributed valuable perspective as American consumption accelerated through the 1950s and 60s. Families like the Kowalskis served as living reminders that the abundance surrounding them wasn't universal or inevitable, that within living memory, even basic necessities had been uncertain in societies previously considered developed and stable. This perspective proved especially valuable during the Cold War's ideological competitions. When Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev declared in 1959 that the Soviet Union would bury the United States economically, immigrants from Eastern Europe offered first-hand testimony contradicting Soviet claims of imminent productive superiority. Their direct experience with both systems, having lived under Soviet influence before emigrating, provided credibility that native-born Americans making similar arguments couldn't match. Tomasz Kowalski, who had become a high school mathematics teacher in Chicago, frequently shared his observations with students and colleagues. His perspective was particularly valuable because it wasn't ideologically motivated. He had no intrinsic preference for capitalism over socialism before experiencing both systems' practical outcomes. His judgment was based on observed results rather than theoretical commitments, giving his testimony particular weight in ideological debates that often generated more heat than light. The difference wasn't in what people said about their systems, he often explained. The difference was in what ordinary people could take for granted. In Poland after the war, having an orange was a special occasion. In Chicago, my students complain if the cafeteria serves the same fruit twice in 1 week. This concrete, experience-based comparison focusing on tangible outcomes for ordinary citizens rather than abstract principles or exceptional cases characterized the most effective critiques of Soviet economic claims throughout the Cold War period. The most persuasive argument wasn't that capitalism produced more billionaires, but that it produced more refrigerators, automobiles, telephones, and television sets for average families. The revelation that had begun with chocolate bars being casually distributed to refugee children had evolved into systematic comparison of living standards for ordinary citizens under competing economic systems. By the 1960s, as the Kowalski children reached adulthood, the transformation that had begun with that February encounter had extended to a second generation. Marek, who had followed his father into mathematics, became an engineer with an electronics firm developing components for NASA's space program. Anya, benefiting from educational opportunities unavailable to most European women of her generation, earned a medical degree and established a practice serving immigrant communities in Chicago. Their career paths illustrated a multi-generational transformation, from Polish refugees shocked by the casual distribution of chocolate bars to productive participants in the system that generated such abundance. This transformation wasn't unique to the Kowalskis, but was replicated across millions of European immigrants who experienced similar revelations during and after the war. Their collective journey from encounter to disbelief to acceptance to participation represented one of the most significant ideological migrations in modern history. The culmination of this transformation came in November 1989 when Marek Kowalski, then 55 years old, watched television coverage of the Berlin Wall's opening. The barrier that had physically divided competing economic systems, preventing Eastern Europeans from directly encountering Western abundance, was literally being dismantled by citizens who had finally lost faith in official narratives. Marek recognized in those scenes the same revelation he had experienced 44 years earlier, peering through a fence at American soldiers casually handling unimaginable wealth. The East Germans streaming through openings in the wall were experiencing that same cognitive dissonance, the unbridgeable gap between what they had been told about Western conditions and what they could now see with their own eyes. The collapse that followed, not just of the wall, but of the entire Soviet system, represented the final vindication of the revelation that had begun with Polish children following the smell of chocolate to an American distribution center. The abundance glimpsed through that fence in 1945 had proved not just real but sustainable and scalable, ultimately producing living standards that competing systems couldn't match despite decades of promises and periodic reforms. This outcome wasn't inevitable. The encounter between American abundance and European deprivation in 1945 represented a historical contingency, a moment when material realities overwhelmed ideological narratives with irrefutable evidence. Had the war ended differently, had American forces not occupied Western Europe, had the Marshall Plan not institutionalized American economic support, the competing systems might have evolved along different trajectories with different perceived legitimacy. The significance of that February moment when children followed the smell of chocolate to discover a reality contradicting everything they had been taught extended far beyond the immediate relief of hunger or the shock of encountering abundance amid devastation. It represented the beginning of a cognitive revolution that would ultimately encompass hundreds of millions of people across multiple generations, a revolution not of abstract principles, but of tangible expectations about what ordinary life should include and what systems of economic organization could deliver. This revolution, like the one that began with Marek and Ania peering through a fence, wasn't primarily about ideology. It was about evidence, about what could be seen, touched, and tasted. The chocolate bars distributed by Sergeant Dominguez might seem trivial compared to competing economic theories or geopolitical strategies, but they offered something theories couldn't: immediate, sensory proof that another reality was possible. The power of this evidence lay partly in its mundane nature. Grand claims about industrial production or technological achievement could be dismissed as propaganda or exceptional cases. But the casual distribution of chocolate bars, items that had been legendary treasures under occupation by ordinary soldiers who clearly took such abundance for granted, couldn't be explained away. It revealed not just material differences, but fundamentally different relationships to scarcity itself, differences that would shape individual decisions, national policies, and international relations for decades to follow. For the aging Kowalski family, watching Soviet systems collapse across Eastern Europe in 1989 and 1990, the television coverage brought a sense of historical completion. The revelation they had experienced personally in February 1945 had finally become universal, acknowledged even by systems that had spent decades denying its reality. The abundance first glimpsed through that fence had ultimately proved not just real but transformative, reshaping the world order established after World War II. Tomasz Kowalski, by then 78 years old and retired from teaching, expressed this sense of completion in a letter to Captain Robert Anderson, with whom he had maintained correspondence for over 40 years. "What began with chocolate bars has ended with the fall of empires," he wrote. "The same disbelief we felt looking at your supplies in 1945 is visible on the faces of young East Germans seeing West Berlin shops for the first time. The truth revealed by abundance has finally become undeniable." This observation captured the essence of transformation through abundance, the way material reality, when it diverges dramatically from official narratives, can ultimately undermine even the most comprehensive ideological systems. The chocolate bars that American soldiers casually distributed to Polish refugee children contained within them not just sugar and cocoa, but evidence of a productive capacity that would eventually redraw the map of Europe and restructure the global order. The Kowalski family's journey from that fence in Żagań to integration into American society represented in microcosm the larger transformation of post-war Europe. Their initial shock at American abundance evolved into adaptation, participation, and eventually advocacy for the system that had produced such divergent outcomes. Their experience illuminated not just the material contrasts between competing systems, but the psychological and ideological adjustments required to integrate those contrasts into coherent understanding. This integration wasn't simple or immediate. It required reconciling observed reality with prior beliefs, adjusting expectations formed under scarcity to accommodate new abundance, and developing new frameworks for evaluating competing claims about economic and social organization. For the Kowalskis, like millions of others who experienced similar revelations, this adjustment extended across years and decades, gradually transforming not just what they believed, but how they evaluated evidence and made decisions. The persistence of this transformation, its ability to withstand competing narratives and contrary evidence over decades, testified to the power of direct experience in shaping fundamental understanding. What Marek and Anya saw through that offense in February 1945 couldn't be unseen or explained away. It became a reference point against which all subsequent claims about economic systems, resource distribution, and social organization would be measured. This reference point proved remarkably stable across decades of Cold War competition, as Soviet systems attempted various reforms and adjustments while maintaining fundamental ideological commitments. Each new initiative, from Khrushchev's agricultural reforms to Gorbachev's perestroika, was measured against the standard established by that initial encounter with American abundance. When these reforms failed to produce comparable outcomes for ordinary citizens, they reinforced, rather than undermined, the original revelation. By the time the Soviet system finally acknowledged its inability to match Western living standards, implicit in Gorbachev's reforms and explicit in the system's collapse, the children who had followed their smell of chocolate in 1945 had become grandparents. Their revelation had been validated not just by personal experience, but by the collective judgment of history, as competing systems ultimately conceded the reality they had glimpsed through that fence decades earlier. The legacy of this transformation extended beyond the Cold War's conclusion to shape expectations and aspirations in the post-Soviet era. Nations emerging from communist control measured success not by ideological consistency, but by tangible improvements in daily life. The availability of consumer goods, the quality of housing, the reliability of services. The standard established by American abundance in 1945 had become the benchmark against which all subsequent systems would be evaluated. This standard wasn't without complications or contradictions. The abundance that seemed miraculous to Polish refugee children contained within it challenges that would become increasingly apparent in subsequent decades. Environmental impacts, resource limitations, social inequalities. The system that produced chocolate bars in quantities sufficient for casual distribution also produced waste, pollution, and periodic instability. These complexities would shape ongoing debates about economic organization, resource allocation, and sustainability long after the Cold War's conclusion. Yet despite these complications, the fundamental revelation remained valid. Systems that harness human creativity, incentivize innovation, and allow decentralized decision-making can produce material abundance beyond what centrally planned alternatives have historically delivered. This insight, first glimpsed through a fence in February 1945, has shaped economic development, political alignment, and personal aspirations across generations and continents. For the aging Kowalski family watching a new century dawn from their Chicago home, this insight had come full circle. The revelation that began with children following the smell of chocolate had evolved through personal adaptation, professional contribution, and ultimately historical vindication. Their journey from occupied Poland to American suburbia, from desperate scarcity to comfortable abundance, embodied the transformation that reshaped the post-war world. The chocolate bars that American soldiers casually distributed in that makeshift distribution center hadn't just alleviated momentary hunger. They had initiated a cognitive revolution that would eventually encompass half the globe, challenging fundamental assumptions about economic organization, human motivation, and material possibility. This revolution, unlike many that preceded it, succeeded not through force or coercion, but through demonstration, through the irrefutable evidence of abundance made visible to those who had known only scarcity. In this sense, the story of Polish children following the smell of chocolate to discover American soldiers creating care packages represented more than a heartwarming anecdote from the war's conclusion. It captured the essence of transformation through abundance, the way material reality, when dramatically divergent from prevailing narratives, can reshape understanding more effectively than any argument or ideology. The chocolate bars distributed in Jagan in February 1945 contained within them not just confectionery pleasure, but evidence of possibilities that would ultimately transform the world. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the narrow streets of Arnhem on the morning of September 21, 1944. Johanna Vermeer, a 73-year-old widow who had survived on scraps and tulip bulbs for months, followed her nose through the rubble-strewn alleyways. Her bony fingers clutched a worn shawl around her shoulders as she shuffled forward, each step a testament to her determination, despite gnawing hunger that had reduced her once sturdy frame to a mere 87 pounds. What she discovered around the corner defied 4 years of Nazi propaganda and German occupation. British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division, themselves weary from 9 days of brutal combat, had pooled their precious rations to create an impromptu bakery in the bombed-out remains of a small cafe. The soldiers, who according to German propaganda were supposed to be barbaric and selfish invaders, had saved their own meager supplies for weeks before the operation, not for themselves, but for the starving Dutch civilians they hoped to liberate. It smelled like heaven itself had opened up, Johanna would later write in her diary. I had not seen proper bread in nearly 2 years. The young British soldier handed me a warm loaf and refused to take anything in return. His uniform was torn and bloodied, yet he gave away what little he had. This was not the enemy we had been warned about. In the German newspapers, what Johanna and hundreds of other Dutch civilians witnessed that autumn day defied years of carefully crafted Nazi indoctrination about the Allied forces. The paratroopers, despite being cut off from their supply lines and fighting for survival in what would later be called Operation Market Garden, had made feeding the local population a priority. Captain Richard Holloway of the 3rd Battalion had organized the effort, converting damaged cooking equipment from abandoned homes into a makeshift bakery. Using flour they had parachuted in with and supplementing it with their own ration packs, the British soldiers created something more powerful than any weapon in their arsenal: hope delivered through the simple act of sharing food. The scene in Arnhem that day represented a microcosm of a larger pattern that would repeat itself across Europe as Allied forces advanced. The shocking disparity between Nazi propaganda about Western Allied soldiers and the reality of their conduct, particularly regarding food and supplies, would become one of the most effective weapons in undermining the German occupation. The small acts of sacrifice by individual soldiers would ultimately reveal a devastating truth. The supposed material superiority of the Third Reich was a carefully constructed illusion that crumbled in the face of genuine Allied abundance. The roots of this disparity stretched back to the early years of the war. By 1944, the German propaganda machine had spent years portraying Britain as a nation on the brink of starvation, its empire crumbling, its people subsisting on meager rations while German citizens enjoyed the fruits of conquest. Joseph Goebbels's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda regularly published comparative statistics showing supposedly generous German civilian rations alongside the restricted British allowances. Dutch newspapers under Nazi control printed weekly columns describing food riots in London and desperate conditions across the British Isles. According to these reports, British soldiers were poorly equipped, malnourished, and fighting merely to satisfy the greed of their plutocratic leaders. The reality, as Johanna and her neighbors discovered, was starkly different. Britain had indeed implemented a strict rationing system early in the war, but it was designed to ensure equitable distribution rather than reflecting absolute scarcity. The average British civilian received approximately 3,400 calories daily throughout most of the war, less than pre-war consumption but nutritionally adequate. More importantly, the British military was exceptionally well provisioned, with soldiers receiving carefully balanced rations designed by nutritionists to maintain peak fighting capability. The standard British Army Compo ration pack for 14 men contained 28 tins of meat and vegetables, 14 tins of pudding, 70 packets of biscuits, 14 tins of fruit, 28 bars of chocolate, and numerous other items including tea, sugar, powdered milk, and cigarettes. Each paratrooper who landed near Arnhem carried at least 3 days' worth of these supplies, supplemented by specialized high-energy combat rations. The British soldiers who shared their food with Dutch civilians were not giving away government surplus. They were sacrificing their own personal rations, sometimes putting themselves at risk of hunger to help those in even greater need. In contrast, by September 1944, the average Dutch civilian under German occupation was subsisting on approximately 900 calories per day, less than one-third the minimum required for basic health maintenance. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 would soon reduce this further, eventually claiming the lives of approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians through starvation and related illnesses. Willem Bakker, a 42-year-old history teacher from Utrecht, documented the psychological impact of this contrast in his secret journal. We had been told repeatedly that England was starving, that Churchill's empire was collapsing from within, he wrote on October 3, 1944. Then we see these British soldiers, healthy and strong despite their battle fatigue, sharing tins of meat and chocolate with our children. How could the Germans have expected us to believe their lies when the evidence was being handed to us in paper wrappings? The journey of discovery for Dutch civilians began with small, almost mundane observations that collectively painted a picture of Allied abundance that seemed impossible after years of occupation. Maria van der Hoeven, a 36-year-old mother of 4 from Eindhoven, recorded her first encounter with American soldiers in September 1944. The young man could not have been older than 20, she wrote. He gave my children something called juicy fruit gum and small wrapped chocolates from his pocket as casually as if they were pebbles. When I tried to thank him, he simply reached into his pack and produced more. My youngest son asked if he was very rich in America, Nia, and he laughed and said, "No, ma'am." This is standard issue. That casual phrase, standard issue, would become a turning point in the psychological warfare between occupiers and liberators. Across the Netherlands, Belgium, and later parts of France, civilians began to understand that what seemed like extraordinary generosity to them was merely the baseline of Allied supply. Captain Thomas Green of the 101st Airborne Division documented numerous instances of Dutch civilians expressing disbelief at the contents of standard American K rations and C rations. Had to explain to a local baker that the white bread in our rations wasn't special holiday food, he wrote on September 25, 1944. Poor fellow couldn't believe we ate this well every day. When I showed him the dated packages proving these were made months ago and shipped over in bulk, he sat down on a curb and wept. Said his family hadn't seen white flour in 3 years. The American K ration designed as a single-day combat meal, contained a breakfast unit, a dinner unit, and a supper unit, each in separate wax cardboard boxes. Every meal included canned entrees such as chopped ham and eggs or processed cheese, biscuits, a chocolate bar or caramels, instant coffee, and cigarettes. To Dutch civilians who had subsisted primarily on turnips, sugar beets, and occasionally potatoes for years, these standard-issue meals appeared as luxurious as fine restaurant dining. Lieutenant Sarah Collins, a British nurse with the 2nd Army Medical Corps, recorded in her official report from October 1944 the medical impact of this disparity. Dutch patients admitted to our field hospital display significant signs of malnutrition, including protein deficiency, calcium deficiency, and severe vitamin deprivation. Many expressed disbelief at our standard hospital meals, with several elderly patients initially refusing full portions, believing they were being given officers' rations by mistake. When informed these are standard meals for all patients, the psychological effect is often more therapeutic than the nutritional benefits themselves. This realization that what seemed like exceptional luxury was merely standard for Allied forces created ripple effects through occupied communities. Peter Janssen, a Dutch resistance courier who moved between villages near Nijmegen, documented how information about Allied provisions spread like wildfire through underground networks, becoming a form of psychological resistance against German control. Each home that has hosted an Allied soldier becomes a center of information, Janssen wrote in his coded messages. People gather in kitchens to hear descriptions of the tins of meat, the chocolate bars, the cigarettes. One American sergeant showed a family a photograph of his refrigerator at home in Chicago. The image was passed between houses like a religious relic. The Germans have spent years telling us Britain and America are starving, that we are fortunate under their protection. Now everyone knows this was a lie. The evidence of Allied abundance went beyond food. Dutch civilians were astounded by the seemingly limitless supply of fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment. Willem de Vries, a mechanic from Arnhem, wrote about his first encounter with British military vehicles. Their trucks show no signs of parts replacement with inferior materials. All metal construction, rubber tires with deep treads, not the reclaimed rubber or wood composite wheels we've seen on German transports recently. I examined a disabled British Universal carrier, and the quality of the steel plating was superior to anything the occupation forces are now using. Even their engine oil smelled different, refined, to a higher standard than anything we've had access to since 1941. This observation about material quality reflected a fundamental truth that Nazi propaganda had worked desperately to conceal. By 1944, the industrial capacity of the Allied powers, particularly the United States, had reached levels that the Third Reich could not hope to match. American factories were producing approximately 8,000 aircraft per month, compared to Germany's 1,500, a ratio that became impossible to hide once Allied air superiority became visible in the skies over Europe. For Dutch civilians living under occupation, one of the most shocking discoveries was the state of Allied medical care. Emma Visser, a former nurse who had worked in Amsterdam's main hospital until it was commandeered for German military use, documented her observations after being permitted to assist at a British field hospital in October 1944. "Their medical supplies are beyond anything we have seen in years," she wrote. "Penicillin is available for all wounded, not just officers. They have plasma, sulfa drugs, and morphine in quantities that our doctors would consider wasteful." The German authorities requisitioned our hospital's entire monthly supply of antiseptic in April. The British field hospital uses more in a single day than we were allocated for 6 months. A medical officer showed me their supply tent, and I could not stop myself from crying. 3 years of watching patients die for lack of basic medicines, and here these supplies sit in wooden crates, stacked higher than a man can reach. The disparity in medical care became particularly evident as Allied forces began treating Dutch civilians. Dr. Hendrik Bosman, who had maintained a secret practice treating resistance members in Eindhoven, recorded his observations after being invited to observe surgery at an American field hospital in late September 1944. Their surgical instruments are all stainless steel, perfectly maintained, he noted. Each surgeon has multiple complete sets. Compare this to our situation. I have been performing operations with instruments boiled after each use, increasingly dulled, with no replacement parts available. The German military doctors requisitioned our autoclave last year. These Americans have 3 portable autoclaves in a single field unit, running on generators with seemingly unlimited fuel. The contrast extended to blood supplies as well. The Allied forces had pioneered large-scale blood collection and preservation techniques, establishing the first blood banks early in the war. Captain Richard Winters of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment recorded an interaction with Dutch medical staff in his personal journal. Local doctor asked how much blood plasma we had available. When our medics showed him just our company's supply, not even the battalion stocks, the man became visibly emotional. Apparently, the entire province had been allocated less blood by the Germans in the past 6 months than what we carry for a single company. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating evidence of Allied abundance came in the form of food wastage. After years of gathering every scrap and stretching every resource to the breaking point, Dutch civilians were stunned to observe Allied soldiers casually discarding food items that would have been precious treasures under occupation. Jan Smit, a 12-year-old boy from Eindhoven, wrote in his school composition book, "The American soldiers throw away the ends of their cigarettes when they are still long enough to smoke. My father collected these from behind their camp and brought them home wrapped in a handkerchief, his hands shaking with excitement. He said each one had enough tobacco for 3 of our home-rolled cigarettes using newspaper. When I told an American soldier named Bill about this, he gave my father 3 entire packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes. My father put 1 pack in our family Bible for safekeeping. Margaretha de Boer, who had been working as a cook in a German officer's mess hall in Arnhem until the Allied airborne landing, documented her shock at seeing British field kitchen operations. They use canned vegetables and fruits, she wrote, in a letter to her sister in Rotterdam, opening cans, using what they need, sometimes leaving the rest. I have spent 3 years peeling every potato down to its thinnest skin, saving every carrot top for soup, drying every apple core for tea. These men receive crates of cigarettes with their supplies, not as luxuries, but as standard items along with soap and toothpaste. The German officers I cooked for would make a single cigarette last an entire evening, carefully extinguishing it to save the remainder for the next day. The abundance of seemingly minor items created some of the most profound psychological impacts. Private James Wilson of the British 6th Airborne Division recorded in his diary an interaction that demonstrated this principle. Gave an elderly Dutch gentleman a spare pair of bootlaces today when I noticed his shoes tied with string. Would have thought I'd handed him the crown jewels from his reaction. He explained that flexible cord of any kind has been unavailable for purchase since 1942. Bootlaces, he said, are now family heirlooms passed from person to person. Made me think about all the small items we take for granted. The contrast in military equipment became impossible to ignore as Allied forces moved through the Netherlands. The German propaganda narrative had consistently portrayed the Wehrmacht as the best-equipped fighting force in history, with superior technology and abundant supplies. By late 1944, this narrative collapsed under the weight of observable reality. Cornelis van der Hoof, who had served in the Dutch military before the German invasion and maintained a clandestine interest in military affairs, kept detailed notes on equipment disparities. German troops now carry a mixture of weapons. Their own Mausers, captured Russian rifles, Czech models. Some units have different ammunition requirements within the same squad. The British soldiers each carry identical weapons with standardized ammunition. Their uniforms show no signs of patching or repair. They appear to receive new issues regularly. Most striking is their personal equipment. Each man carries waterproof materials, proper entrenching tools, and standardized medical packets. The German soldiers billeted in our town last month had uniforms so heavily repaired they resembled patchwork quilts. This standardization of equipment reflected the industrial might behind the Allied war effort. By 1944, American factories were producing approximately 10 times more military equipment than they had in 1941, with a level of standardization that allowed for unprecedented efficiency in supply and repair. German manufacturing, despite Albert Speer's efforts to rationalize production, remained fragmented across too many models and variants, creating logistical nightmares that became increasingly apparent to both military personnel and observant civilians. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German officer captured during Operation Market Garden, provided a telling observation during his interrogation. We had been told Britain was running out of materials, that American production was a myth created for propaganda. Then I see your supply columns, endless trucks, all the same model, with spare parts that interchange. My company had 7 different vehicles requiring different parts. For the past year, when something broke, we scavenged or improvised because replacements never came. Your men discard equipment I would have treasured. The abundance of Allied supplies created another unexpected psychological weapon: packaging. Gisela Frommer, a cultural anthropologist who documented daily life under occupation, noted this phenomenon in her hidden records. The American rations come in waxed paper, cardboard and tin containers, all clean, printed with dates and instructions, designed to be used once and discarded. This communicates a message no propaganda can counter. These items were manufactured recently in enormous quantities with the expectation of single use. Our people have spent 4 years washing and reusing every container, straightening every nail, patching every fabric. The casual disposal of packaging by Allied soldiers communicates industrial might more effectively than any statistic. This observation about packaging highlighted a fundamental aspect of psychological warfare that neither side had fully anticipated: the power of everyday objects to communicate economic realities. A chocolate bar wrapper printed in bright colors on high-quality paper, casually discarded, told a story about manufacturing capacity that directly contradicted years of German propaganda about Allied material shortages. The evidence of Allied abundance created cascading effects of disillusionment among both civilians and German military personnel. Dieter Müller, a Wehrmacht supply officer stationed in Rotterdam, wrote in his personal journal, later confiscated upon his capture, "Our High Command continues to issue communiqué about British supply problems and American production difficulties. Meanwhile, we can hear their aircraft overhead every night, hundreds, sometimes thousands. Our soldiers now openly joke that the only supply problem the Americans have is finding enough airfields to base their planes." The contrast between official information and observable reality has become too great to ignore. As Allied forces continued their advance, the material evidence of their industrial superiority became increasingly difficult for German authorities to explain away. The official Nazi narrative had relied heavily on the concept of German efficiency versus Allied waste, claiming that despite greater raw resources, the Allied powers lacked the organizational discipline to effectively deploy their materials. This narrative collapsed when Dutch, Belgian, and French civilians witnessed firsthand the logistical capabilities of Allied military operations. Adriaan Voss, who worked as a civil engineer in Amsterdam before the war, kept detailed observations of Allied logistics during the liberation. Their supply system functions with remarkable efficiency despite enormous complexity. Specialized vehicles move specific categories of supplies, ammunition separate from food, medical materials in clearly marked transports. They establish supply dumps with comprehensive inventory systems. Most impressive is their petroleum distribution network, purpose-built pipelines, and dedicated fuel transport vehicles. The Germans had been requisitioning civilian vehicles for fuel transport for the past 2 years, mixing military and civilian supply chains in increasingly desperate arrangements. The specialized nature of Allied logistics equipment revealed another aspect of industrial capacity, the ability to produce purpose-built vehicles rather than adapting civilian designs. By 1944, the German military relied increasingly on requisitioned civilian trucks, often running on wood gas generators due to fuel shortages. The Allied forces, by contrast, deployed purpose-built military vehicles with standardized parts and dedicated maintenance units. This standardization extended to food preparation as well, creating another source of psychological impact through the contrast between Allied and Axis approaches to feeding troops. Wilhelmina Bacher, who had worked as a cook in a large Amsterdam restaurant before it was commandeered as a German officer's mess, recorded her observations after being hired to assist an American field kitchen in October 1944. Their kitchen equipment is designed specifically for military use. Portable, durable, with interchangeable parts. Every pot and utensil is identical to the others, allowing for rapid replacement. They have dedicated equipment just for making coffee. Large percolators that brew enough for hundreds of men. The German officers I cooked for brought equipment requisitioned from hotels and restaurants with no standardization. When something broke, it could not be replaced. By 1944, they were eating from mismatched civilian plates gathered from requisitioned homes. The abundance of food items previously considered luxuries created particularly powerful impressions. Hendrik Visser, a farmer from the outskirts of Arnhem, described his first encounter with American sea rations. The soldier gave me what he called a breakfast unit, containing a small tin of scrambled eggs with ham, a fruit bar, biscuits with apple jelly, and instant coffee with sugar and powdered milk included. He considered this a basic meal. My family had not tasted coffee, sugar, or any form of meat in over 2 years. The powdered milk alone would have been a precious treasure for our children. When I asked if this was special officers' food, he laughed and said, "Even the lowest private receives identical rations." This standardization of quality across ranks represented another psychological blow to German propaganda narratives, which had emphasized the class distinctions supposedly inherent in Western Allied forces. The Nazi propaganda ministry had consistently portrayed British and American armies as rigidly hierarchical, with officers enjoying luxuries, while common soldiers suffered deprivation. The evidence of nutritional equality across ranks directly contradicted this narrative. Captain Thomas Hughes of the American Quartermaster Corps documented this phenomenon in his official report. Local civilians express consistent surprise at the standardization of rations across ranks. They have been conditioned by both their pre-war social structures and German occupation policies to expect significant quality disparities between officers and enlisted men. The fact that a private receives essentially the same food as a colonel represents a form of democratic principle made tangible. This has observable effects on civilian perception of Allied forces and governance structures. The psychological impact extended beyond food to encompass all aspects of material culture. Dutch civilians who had spent years under strict rationing of items like soap, paper, and clothing were astonished by the personal hygiene kits issued to each Allied soldier. These kits typically contained soap, razors, toothbrushes, toothpaste, and other items that had become rare luxuries under German occupation. Maria Janssen, a schoolteacher from Nijmegen, wrote about her students' reaction to these items. An American sergeant visited our class to distribute sweets. One child noticed his shaving kit and asked about it. When he showed them each item, the soap in its own container, a metal tube of shaving cream, multiple razor blades in sealed paper, the children were more fascinated by these than by the chocolate. Peter, who was only 9, asked if the soldier was very wealthy in America. The man seemed confused by the question, until I explained that razor blades have been unavailable for purchase here since 1942. His expression changed to one I've seen repeatedly on Allied soldiers' faces, a mixture of shock and pity that everyday items could be considered luxuries. As Allied forces established more permanent presence in liberated areas, the contrast in material conditions became even more apparent. Field hospitals, supply depots, and administrative centers displayed levels of equipment and supplies that seemed impossible to civilians who had endured years of increasing scarcity. Dr. Elsa van der Meer, who joined a Canadian medical unit as a translator in October 1944, recorded her observations. Their medical supplies arrive in specialized containers, each clearly labeled with expiration dates printed on every package. They receive regular shipments of penicillin, enough that it is used prophylactically, not merely for confirmed infections. Their bandages are pre-sterilized, individually wrapped. They discard surgical gloves after a single use. For the past 3 years, our hospital has been washing, patching, and re-sterilizing the few rubber gloves we had until they became so thin they would tear during procedures. Yesterday, I watched a nurse open a new box containing 100 pairs of surgical gloves. When I commented on the quantity, she said this was a standard weekly allocation for their small field unit. The abundance of medical supplies created profound psychological impacts on both civilian medical personnel and patients. Hendrik de Witt, a pharmacist from Eindhoven, kept detailed records of his observations. After Allied forces established a field hospital in his community, they provided our local clinic with more antibiotics in one delivery than we had seen in the previous 2 years combined. Their standard protocols call for changing wound dressings twice daily. We had been carefully unwrapping, washing and reusing bandages, changing dressings only when absolutely necessary to conserve materials. The German authorities had requisitioned our rubber supplies in 1943, claiming military necessity. Now I see American medics wearing new rubber gloves for even minor procedures, discarding them afterward. Perhaps the most psychologically significant aspect of Allied abundance was its sustainability. Many Dutch civilians initially believed they were witnessing special supplies brought specifically for the invasion, which would soon be exhausted. The continued flow of materials week after week created a growing realization about the true industrial capacity supporting the Allied war effort. Willem van Oranje, who had worked as an economist before the war and maintained secret records of economic conditions under occupation, wrote in November 1944, "It has been 6 weeks since the first Allied units arrived in our region. There has been no diminishment in their supply flow. If anything, it has increased in volume and variety. This represents logistical capabilities that fundamentally contradict everything German authorities have claimed about Allied production capacity. The psychological impact on our community has been profound. People who had reluctantly accepted German narratives about the war's progress can now see with their own eyes the material reality that will determine its outcome. The contrast between propaganda and reality created a form of cognitive dissonance that many German military personnel found difficult to resolve. Captured diaries and letters from Wehrmacht soldiers stationed in the Netherlands reveal growing awareness of the disparity between official narratives and observable conditions. Unteroffizier Franz Müller, captured during fighting near Nijmegen, wrote in his field diary entries from September 1944, "Our propaganda broadcasts continue to claim American manufacturing is collapsing, that Britain stands on the brink of starvation. Yet the Allied soldiers we face appear well-fed and well-equipped, with abundant ammunition and fuel. Our own supply situation deteriorates weekly. We receive fuel sufficient for essential movements only, ammunition with strict conservation orders, food of decreasing quality and quantity." The men joke darkly that perhaps Radio Berlin is broadcasting about our situation, but reversing the sides. This awareness of material disparity created significant morale issues among German occupation forces. Major Wilhelm Schweitzer of the Wehrmacht Logistics Corps, captured in October 1944, provided a telling assessment during his interrogation. By mid-1944, many of our officers had privately concluded that the war was lost on purely material grounds. We could see Allied production statistics from our intelligence services. Even allowing for exaggeration, the numbers were overwhelming. When American and British forces arrived in the Netherlands with fresh equipment, abundant fuel, and seemingly limitless supplies, it merely confirmed what we already suspected. The psychological impact on our troops was perhaps more damaging than the actual combat losses. For Dutch civilians who had endured years of occupation, the material evidence of Allied abundance created a psychological transformation that went beyond immediate relief. People who had been forced to adapt to extreme scarcity suddenly confronted evidence that such adaptations had been unnecessary in other parts of the world, that the deprivation they experienced was not a universal condition of wartime, but a specific consequence of Nazi economic policies and military defeats. Beatrix Kuiper, a social psychologist who kept detailed records of community psychological conditions throughout the occupation and liberation, documented this transformation. There is a distinct pattern in civilian responses to Allied material abundance. Initial reactions typically include disbelief, suspicion that they are being shown exceptional supplies rather than standard provisions, followed by emotional responses ranging from joy to anger as the reality becomes undeniable. The anger is particularly notable, not directed at Allied forces, but at German authorities who had consistently claimed that scarcity was a universal wartime condition affecting all European populations equally. The discovery that this was false creates a retroactive sense of unnecessary suffering. This psychological transformation often manifested in material ways. Dutch civilians who had developed elaborate systems for preserving and reusing every resource suddenly found themselves surrounded by evidence that such extreme measures were unnecessary. The impact on individual psychology was profound and sometimes disorienting. Elizabeth van Houten, who worked as a nurse in Arnhem, described this disorientation in her diary. "For 4 years, I have carefully unwrapped every medication, preserving the paper for reuse. I have washed and dried every bandage until it literally fell apart in my hands. Today, I watched an American medical orderly open a crate containing hundreds of pre-packaged sterile dressings, each in its own sealed envelope. When he tore open a package and the wrapper fell to the floor, I instinctively moved to retrieve it. He noticed and seemed confused. How can I explain that for years such material has been more valuable than money? That we have bound wounds with paper when cloth was unavailable? There is a feeling of unreality to this abundance. As if I have stepped into another world, the psychological transformation extended beyond material conditions to encompass fundamental beliefs about the war itself. Many Dutch civilians had reluctantly accepted German claims about the inevitability of Axis victory, based partly on assertions of material superiority. The physical evidence of Allied abundance directly contradicted this narrative, forcing a comprehensive re-evaluation of the conflict's likely outcome. Professor Johannes de Graaf, a historian at the University of Amsterdam who documented civilian attitudes throughout the occupation, wrote in October 1944, "The material evidence provided by Allied forces has created what might be termed a cascade of disillusionment regarding German propaganda. Once civilians observe the falsity of claims about Allied supply shortages, they begin questioning all other information provided by occupation authorities. This extends beyond military matters to encompass political and ideological claims as well. People who had maintained a cautious neutrality, believing German claims about eventual victory, now openly express confidence in Allied success, based primarily on the observable material disparities. The transformation often created moments of profound emotional release after years of enforced belief in Axis narratives. Margaretha Jansen, a primary school teacher from Rotterdam, described such a moment in a letter written in November 1944. "Yesterday, a British supply convoy passed through our town, truck after truck, carrying food, ammunition, fuel, all in quantities we have not seen since before the invasion. An elderly man beside me on the street began to weep openly. When I asked if he was unwell, he explained that his son had been conscripted to work in a German factory in 1943. The authorities had assured him Germany's superior industrial capacity would ensure victory within 6 months. For over a year, he had clung to this belief, fearing his son would face reprisals if Germany prevailed. Now, seeing the physical evidence of Allied production with his own eyes, he said he finally allowed himself to hope his son would return to a liberated Netherlands. The transformation often affected the youngest civilians most dramatically. Children who had grown up entirely during the occupation period had no memory of pre-war abundance and had been educated under Nazi-controlled curriculum that emphasized German economic and military superiority. Confronting physical evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught created profound psychological adjustments. Peter van den Berg, a 14-year-old from Eindhoven, wrote in his school composition book in October 1944, "The American soldiers let me examine their equipment yesterday. Each man carries a flashlight with spare batteries. My father has not seen working batteries in 3 years. Their uniforms have special waterproof layers. They carry extra socks in waterproof pouches. Each man has his own medical supplies. Our teacher told us last year that American soldiers were poorly equipped and hungry because their factories could not produce enough materials. I asked my father if everything we learned in school was false. He did not answer, but his eyes filled with tears. For many Dutch civilians, the most transformative aspect of Allied abundance was its democratic distribution. Under German occupation, access to increasingly scarce resources had been determined by political reliability, connections to authority figures, and willingness to collaborate. The Allied approach of providing assistance based on need rather than political considerations represented a fundamental contrast in values made tangible through material distribution. Dr. Willem van der Linden, who served on a civilian relief committee in Nijmegen, documented this contrast. The German authorities distributed essential supplies through a hierarchy of political reliability. Party members received preferential treatment, followed by those who demonstrated cooperation with occupation policies. Those suspected of resistance sympathies received minimal allocations, often insufficient for survival. The Allied civil affairs units operate on entirely different principles, providing food and medical care based solely on assessed need, with priority given to the elderly, children, and the ill regardless of their political history. This practical demonstration of values has done more to build goodwill than any propaganda message could achieve. The lasting impact of this material revelation extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of liberation. The experience of witnessing Allied abundance after years of scarcity under German occupation fundamentally reshaped Dutch attitudes toward economic systems, international relations, and European integration in the post-war period. Professor Hendrik Brouwer, an economist who later served in the Dutch post-war Reconstruction Administration, documented this long-term impact. The observable contrast between Allied material abundance and the scarcity experienced under German occupation became a powerful force in shaping post-war Dutch economic and political alignment. Communities that directly experienced this contrast showed measurably stronger support for European economic integration, Marshall Plan participation, and NATO membership than those in regions liberated later or through negotiated withdrawals where the material contrast was less dramatically displayed. The experience fundamentally altered perceptions of the United States in particular, transforming it from a distant, somewhat abstract nation into a tangible source of abundance and practical freedom. Maria van Dijk, who worked as a translator for Allied civil affairs officers in Eindhoven, noted this transformation. Before the war, many Dutch people held somewhat stereotypical views of Americans as materialistic and lacking cultural refinement. The experience of liberation created a profound reassessment. Material abundance ceased to be viewed as superficial and instead became associated with freedom and human dignity. The American soldier sharing his rations, casual in his generosity, became a symbol not just of military power but of a society where ordinary citizens could take such abundance for granted. This transformation would significantly influence post-war Dutch economic development and international alignment. The Netherlands became one of the strongest supporters of the Marshall Plan and European economic integration, partly based on this first-hand experience of the relationship between industrial capacity, material abundance, and human welfare. The contrast between propaganda and reality revealed through Allied abundance would also shape Dutch institutional development in the post-war era. The experience of systematic deception under occupation created a strong cultural emphasis on factual accuracy and institutional transparency that characterized Dutch governance and media in subsequent decades. Johanna Vermeer, the elderly woman who had followed the smell of British baked bread through the streets of Arnhem in September 1944, survived the war and later recorded her reflections in a memoir published in 1952. What I discovered that morning was more than food. It was truth made tangible. For years, we had been told that Britain was starving, that American industrial might was a myth. Then I held in my hands a warm loaf of bread made by soldiers who had saved their own rations to feed strangers. This experience taught me to judge systems not by their words, but by their capacity to create and share abundance. In the years since, whenever I hear grand political promises, I remember that bread and ask, where is the tangible evidence? What does this system actually produce? How is it shared? These questions have guided my choices at every election since liberation. The material evidence of Allied abundance thus created effects that extended far beyond the immediate military situation, reshaping fundamental perceptions of political and economic systems through tangible personal experience. What began with the simple smell of bread baking in a ruined cafe ultimately transformed an entire generation's understanding of economic possibility and political truth. Historian Dr. Anton Bakker, who documented the long-term social effects of the liberation in his 1972 study, Material Witnesses, Dutch Civilian Experiences of Liberation, concluded, the profound psychological impact of witnessing Allied material abundance after years of scarcity cannot be overstated. It created a form of embodied knowledge that propaganda could not counter, direct sensory experience of economic realities that contradicted years of carefully constructed narratives. This experience fundamentally altered Dutch political development, creating a pragmatic skepticism toward ideological claims not supported by material evidence. The experience of Allied abundance continued to influence Dutch society long after the war ended. The contrast between memory and reality shaped everything from consumer behavior to political alignment during the crucial early years of the Cold War. Communities that had directly experienced the stark disparity between Nazi propaganda and Allied reality developed a distinctive form of skepticism toward Soviet claims during the post-war period. Gerrit Vermeulen, who served as the mayor of a small town near Arnhem from 1947 to 1968, observed this phenomenon in local voting patterns. Our citizens, who directly witnessed the British and American supplies in 1944, developed what I would call material skepticism toward political claims. When Soviet representatives would speak about worker prosperity behind the Iron Curtain, these citizens would ask very specific questions about consumer goods availability, housing quality, and food distribution, precisely the tangible evidence they had learned to value during the occupation and liberation. Abstract ideological arguments gained little traction where people had learned to judge systems by their material outputs. This material skepticism influenced Dutch institutional development significantly in the post-war years. The Netherlands developed some of Europe's most transparent economic reporting systems, with particular emphasis on making statistical data accessible to ordinary citizens rather than restricting it to experts. This institutional characteristic can be traced directly to the experience of systematic deception during occupation, followed by the revelatory impact of observable Allied abundance. Professor Margaretha de Jong, who studied post-war institutional development across Western Europe, noted this connection in her 1988 comparative analysis. Dutch economic reporting systems developed distinctive features compared to other European nations recovering from occupation. There was unusual emphasis on verifiable material measures, specific production outputs, consumption statistics, and quality standards, with less focus on aggregate indicators that could mask distribution inequalities. This approach can be directly traced to wartime experiences, particularly the contrast between occupation propaganda and the physical evidence of Allied abundance that became visible in 1944. The material lessons of that remarkable autumn continued to resonate through Dutch society in numerous subtle ways. Educational curricula developed after the war placed unusual emphasis on economic literacy and statistical reasoning compared to other European systems. Consumer protection regulations focused particularly on accurate representation of product qualities and quantities. Media accountability standards emphasized factual verification over editorial balance. All these institutional characteristics reflected lessons learned through the contrast between propaganda claims and material realities during the pivotal period of liberation. For individuals who experienced this contrast firsthand, the memory remained extraordinarily vivid decades later. Interviews conducted with Dutch citizens in the 1970s and 80s revealed that sensory details of first encounters with Allied abundance remained among their most powerful wartime memories. The smell of coffee from American ration packs, the texture of British chocolate, the sound of fully fueled transport columns moving through their communities. Hendrik van der Veen, who was 16 years old during the liberation of Eindhoven, described this sensory memory in an interview recorded in 1982. Even now, the smell of chocolate takes me instantly back to that day in September 1944, when an American soldier handed me a Hershey bar. I had never tasted chocolate so rich. Our pre-war chocolate had been much lighter, and during the occupation, we had nothing similar at all. That taste represented everything about liberation to me, not just freedom from occupation, but the revelation that abundance was possible, that scarcity had been imposed rather than inevitable. When people talk about the meaning of freedom, I think of that chocolate and all it represented. The British troops who had saved their rations for weeks to bake bread for Dutch civilians demonstrated something profound about the relationship between material resources and human dignity. Their actions represented not merely charity, but respect, recognition that sharing abundance was a form of acknowledging shared humanity after years of systematic dehumanization under occupation. Captain Richard Holloway, who had organized the bakery operation in Arnhem, reflected on this in his memoir published in 1958. What I remember most vividly is not the gratitude, though that was certainly present, but the restoration of dignity I witnessed. People who had been reduced to scavenging for tulip bulbs stood straighter after receiving bread that came not as charity, but as an acknowledgment of their rightful place in the civilized world. We gave what we had saved from our own rations, not because the Dutch were objects of pity, but because they were fellow human beings, temporarily displaced from the normal conditions of modern society. Conditions our combined Allied production was making possible again, that fundamental message that abundance was not only possible but could be widely shared, created lasting changes in how Dutch society viewed economic organization and international relations. The Marshall Plan, when implemented several years later, found unusually strong support in the Netherlands, partly because its premises aligned with direct wartime experience. American productive capacity could generate abundance sufficient to rebuild European prosperity if properly deployed and distributed. Dr. Willem Koopmans, who served on the Dutch Economic Planning Bureau during the crucial 1947 to 1952 period, noted this connection. There was remarkably little resistance to Marshall Plan implementation in the Netherlands compared to some other European nations. Much of this can be attributed to direct wartime experience. Many key decision-makers and ordinary citizens had personally witnessed American abundance during liberation. They had seen with their own eyes what American production could achieve and how it could be deployed for reconstruction rather than destruction. This created a form of trust that no amount of political argumentation could have established. the material lessons of liberation extended to military and security arrangements as well. Dutch support for NATO membership was influenced significantly by the tangible experience of Allied logistics capabilities, demonstrated during liberation. Having witnessed firsthand the contrast between propaganda claims and observable reality, Dutch security planners placed high value on the physical evidence of defensive capabilities rather than diplomatic assurances alone. General Peter van Hoyts, who served on the early Dutch NATO Planning Committee, referenced this influence in his memoirs. Our wartime experience had taught us to evaluate security arrangements based on observable material factors rather than political declarations. Having seen the contrast between German claims of military superiority and the actual material evidence once Allied forces arrived, we developed a pragmatic approach to alliance structures focused on verifiable capabilities. The American willingness to maintain substantial forces in Europe with observable logistical supply chains provided exactly the kind of material evidence our experiences had taught us to value. Perhaps most fundamentally, the experience altered how an entire generation understood the relationship between economic systems and human welfare. The contrast between scarcity under occupation and Allied abundance created a visceral understanding that material conditions were not merely economic questions, but fundamental components of human dignity and freedom. Maria Jansen, who had been a young mother during the occupation and later became active in Dutch women's organizations, expressed this understanding in a 1967 interview. Before experiencing occupation and liberation, I viewed economics as somewhat separate from more important concerns like culture, family, and spiritual life. The war taught me that material conditions fundamentally shape human possibilities in all domains. When your children lack proper food, when basic items like soap and medicine are unavailable, all other aspects of life become diminished. The Americans and British who arrived with their seemingly endless supplies showed us that abundance makes human dignity possible on a broad scale. This wasn't about luxury or materialism. It was about the basic conditions that allow people to live as full human beings. This understanding influenced Dutch approaches to post-war reconstruction and social policy. Rather than viewing economic development as distinct from social welfare, Dutch planning integrated these concerns based partly on wartime experiences of how material scarcity under occupation had undermined community cohesion and individual dignity. Historian Emma de Wit, specializing in post-war European reconstruction, noted this distinctive approach. Dutch post-war planning documents show unusually integrated approaches to economic and social development compared to other European nations. Economic targets were consistently linked to specific quality-of-life improvements, rather than treated as separate objectives. This integrated approach reflected wartime experiences of how material conditions directly affected social cohesion and individual well-being. Having witnessed how Allied material abundance immediately strengthened community resilience during liberation, planners incorporated these lessons into reconstruction. Frameworks for the elderly Dutch citizens who had followed the smell of fresh bread to discover British soldiers operating their makeshift bakery in September 1944. The experience represented more than temporary relief from hunger. It provided tangible evidence of alternative possibilities after years of enforced scarcity, evidence that would influence their understanding of political and economic systems for decades to come. Johanna Vermeer, who had been among the first to discover the British bakery operation, continued to bake bread well into her 80s, sharing it with neighbors and family in a small ritual that connected back to that transformative moment. In her last interview before her death in 1977, she reflected on the lasting significance of what she had witnessed. What those young British soldiers showed us went far beyond kindness, though their kindness was remarkable. They showed us that another world was possible, that the scarcity we had endured was not inevitable, but imposed. They had saved their own rations for weeks, not because they had been ordered to, but because they recognized our common humanity. That recognition, made tangible through shared bread, taught me more about true freedom than any grand political speech could have done. I have spent the decades since trying to live by that lesson, that freedom means nothing without the material capacity to share what we have with others in need. The story of Dutch elderly following the smell of fresh bread to discover British troops who had saved their rations for weeks became emblematic of a larger historical truth. That abstract political systems ultimately manifest in tangible human experiences, and that the most effective challenge to propaganda lies not in counter-propaganda, but in observable reality. The British and American forces who arrived in the Netherlands in 1944 brought not just military power, but material evidence that contradicted years of carefully constructed narratives, evidence that transformed understanding in ways that would shape Dutch society for generations to come. As the Netherlands rebuilt in the post-war years, this experience influenced approaches to everything from economic organization to international relations, from consumer protection to political transparency. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and Allied reality created a form of embodied knowledge that no amount of subsequent ideological argumentation could erase, a standard of judgment based on tangible evidence rather than abstract claims. Willem Bakker, the history teacher who had documented his observations during liberation, continued teaching until 1971. In his final lecture before retirement, he reflected on the lasting significance of what he had witnessed. History is ultimately about human experience, not abstract forces. What I learned in 1944 was that systems must be judged not by their claims, but by their tangible outputs, what they produce, how it is distributed, who benefits, who suffers. The smell of bread baking in a ruined cafe, created by soldiers who had saved their own rations to feed strangers, taught me more about the meaning of freedom than any textbook ever could. It is that lesson, more than any date or battle or treaty, that I hope my students will carry forward, that freedom and abundance are inseparable, and that both must be judged by their material reality rather than their theoretical promise. That lesson, learned through the direct sensory experience of unexpected abundance after years of increasing scarcity, would continue to influence Dutch society long after the specific events of liberation faded from living memory, a testament to the power of material reality to shape understanding more profoundly than any propaganda narrative, however skillfully constructed, could achieve.